Hallo, guten Morgen. Darf ich bitten, Platz zu nehmen, sich anzuschnallen? Getränke werden in der Pause serviert. Ich begrüße alle herzlich zum zweiten Tag unserer Studientage zur Querflöte im 19. Jahrhundert. Nach dem sehr inspirierenden, fast aufregenden Konzert gestern Abend müssen wir uns jetzt wieder dem grauen Alltag der Wissenschaft zuwenden. Wir haben relativ viele Beiträge heute Morgen, die dafür etwas kürzer sind. Um 11 wird es eine Kaffeepause geben und in der Mittagspause, die etwas kürzer ist als gestern, gibt es die Möglichkeit, Instrumente auszuprobieren, und zwar nicht nur die angekündigten von Mareike Reichmann, sondern ich habe gehört, es gibt einige Sammler oder was immer sie sind, die haben Flöten mitgebracht, die sie auch gerne zeigen, die man auch ausprobieren kann. Die sind in demselben Raum 1005, wo gestern schon der Nachbau von Boris Burney zu sehen war. Ich kündige erst nochmal an, das ist in der Mittagspause. Jetzt freue ich mich, als ersten Redner Francesco Carreras aus Pisa anzugründen. Francesco ist auch sehr, in unseren Kreisen bekannt. Beruflich hat er ganz was anderes gemacht, Cognitive Musicology, unter anderem Informatik, aber er ist vor allen Dingen bekannt wegen seiner sehr großen Sammlung von italienischen Instrumenten, Blasinstrumenten, Flöteninstrumenten und seinen Kenntnissen zu diesem sehr italienischen Instrumenten. Und nennen möchte ich nur die Publikation I Brevetti Italiani sugli strumenti musicali, ein sehr hilfreiches Nachschlagewerk. Bitte, Francesco.
Thank you, Martin. I would like to start. Softer, I try. Okay. Just a few more words about my background. As Martin told me, my background until I retired in 2012 was on the scientific side. But I would like to stress that I'm not a flute player, and therefore my knowledge about some details of what I will be presenting now, especially special keys or key arrangements, I cannot give a very precise evaluation because I didn't play the instruments. But in the case that the makers themselves make clear what the function of some special keys were, but this is not always the case. And I will, just because I have some time constraint, I have to skip the first part of my presentation, which was about just a survey of flute making in Italy during the 19th century. And I will concentrate on the main new models, which were special models, which were presented in Italy in the 19th century and early 20th century. And not all of them, but the main ones. So, as an introduction, and to enter immediately into the spirit of the discussion, I will first mention an innovative flute described by Giovanni Battista Orazio of Naples in his essay on building and playing in an harmonic transverse flute that has all the low tones of the violin with two mixed enharmonic trios, there are two pieces of music, published in Rome in 1797. Orazio, active as an officer in the Bourbon Army, was also a composer and a fine amateur flutist. His flute had a foot joint extension to low G, a bent foot joint, and a claim compass of 4 octaves. There were 5 closed keys, maybe a little more light for reading. body, as the usual for the flutes of the time, and 7 open keys on the foot joint. With special fingerings, showing the fingering charts added to the book, it could produce quarter tones and so an octave of 24 equally spaced intervals. It appears as an early example of the adoption in the flute of the equal tempo scale in 24 intervals, a true ETS 24 system. He claimed that the portamento and glissando effects could be made possible. This is the scale with the special symbol used for the quarter tones. It is documented that this particular flute was really built and played in several occasions. At Orazio's death, the instrument was offered on sale by his brother to the Minister of Education in Naples, but the offer was rejected. The same Giovanni Paisiello was asked for a judgment, which was negative because of the lack of a specific repertoire for that kind of flute. Indeed, the Panalon by Trexler, invented by Trexler in 1813 and was built by Stefan Koch in 1815 in Vienna, either with bended or sprayed foot and 17 keys, and later made also by Johann Ziegler in Austria, but also produced in Italy by several makers. Flutes with a foot extension to low A were built in Italy up to the 1930s, and many examples survive today. The musical environment in Naples, the town where Orazio invented his flute, had been very lively in and outside the court environment, and during the 18th and the first half of the following century, Naples remained one of the most significant musical centers of Europe. Famous composers, music performances, and theaters at many charitable institutes where music was taught. And the foundation of the Conservatorio San Pietro Maiella in 1807 characterized the first decades of the 19th century. Music was encouraged by many members of the Bourbon family. Many wood makers are known, active in that period of time, but the name that emerged as the most skilled and appreciated woodwind maker was that of Gennaro Bosa. In a record of the exhibition on 1836 in Naples, a 17-key flute with bended G foot along the Orazio tradition is described. Differently from the Trexler Panau, it had shell-shaped key covers, a water key on the bottom of the foot joint, and intonation silver slides on every joint. Here is a citation from that record of the exhibition. In ordinary flutes, when this lengthening is made, the head joint remains detached from the first middle piece. And besides that, the tuning cannot be well preserved, since the proportion of the length of the tube is no longer maintained, a double inconvenience to which Mr. Bosas has obviated. These instruments were highly praised and preferred by the performers to the instrument from abroad. His style was characterized by elegant profile, refined craftsmanship, and much appreciated musical qualities. He made mostly flutes and clarinets. Recently, a BEM 1832 model flute, marked Gennaro Bosa, came to light. No mention of the name Bosa appears after 1836. The discovery represents an important confirmation of the attention that was paid in Naples to the new BEM flutes since the very beginning. Under this respect, particularly active was the Neapolitan flute school, where the prominent figure of Emanuel Kracham since the 1830s became a fervent supporter of the new BEM flute and was the first in Italy to write a method published by Giovanni Ricordi in 1854 titled Method for the Cylindrical Flute by BEM. But the adoption of the BEM flute was strongly opposed by the majority of the Italian flutists, and the experience of Naples remained isolated at least up to the end of the century. In fact, the conservative attitude of many virtuosos and teachers of the flute and the reluctance to undertake the challenging study of the new system, combined with the general preference for the tempo of the conical bore wooden flute, hindered the adoption of the BEM flute in musical schools, in orchestras, and in musical performances in general. As a matter of fact, the sound of the traditional wooden flute was more suitable for the execution of the wide production of variation of opera motifs or similar, which was fashionable during the most of the 18th century in Italy. The reluctance to accept the new BEM system flute and the persistent use of the simple system flutes all over Italy for most of the 19th century inspired the invention of new models and systems that could exploit the evident advantages of the mechanical innovation of the Böhm flute while trying to maintain the traditional fingerings, as on the other hand happened also in other nations, the UK first, but also in Germany and France, or inspire enhancements to the simple system flute or to the same Böhm system itself. The earliest and most successful attempt was carried out in a period of several decades by Giulio Bricialdi. Bricialdi, born in 1818, became very soon an acclaimed performer on the simple system flute. He had personal relationships with Theobald Böhm, who in 1847 entrusted him with the flute number 1 of the new model with the task of demonstrating its qualities in London. But Bricialdi, after a few months, gave up because of the difficulties with the new fingerings and started to develop his own model. Bricialdi aimed at creating an instrument with the sound volume of the 1847 Böhm flute, but tempered by a great sweetness of timbre that had the tone holes in the acoustically correct positions and exploited the mechanical novelties, but primarily a flute which could assure the traditional fingerings. The first model was realized in 1852 by Johann Ziegler in Vienna and later by Egidio Forni in Milan. These instruments had conical bore because the cylindric bore was still protected by Böhm's patent. In 1869, he could present his first model with conical head joint and cylindrical body. Several different models followed in a few years, and after his death in 1881, his widow patented, mostly for commercial reasons, 10 additional models based on design left by Bricialdi himself, which differed mainly in the number of keys being aimed at performers with different levels of ability. This is just, to give you an idea, this is the plate of the first patent by the widow, and this is the second with the models. And here is another, well, just to finish, this flute was adopted by the Conservatory of Florence and obtained a satisfactory commercial success also in the bands. This is another configuration which is not, there are many, I have at least 4, which are configuration of keys which are not in the patents. So Bricialdi aimed at improving his flute, probably was never completely satisfied with the results. What he worked mostly for was the venting for the third octave with different configurations. There is a very complicated in the bottom figure. The Bricialdi system flute, although remains the most successful example of an alternative to the band system in Italy, certainly was not the only one. A relevant number of proposals were submitted in the time frame of a few decades, and we gathered them in functional groups for description purposes. Manufacturing technologies. Here, the double wall technology. Forbidden wind instrument was patented by Agostino Rampone in 1879. The patent title was Flutes and Clarinets entirely made of metal. Even if metal and double wall instruments had been previously built by other makers, Rampone developed his technology in original ways and made very fine instruments extending the construction to the clarinets, oboes, and bassoons. Just recently, I saw the first example of a metal bassoon double wall, which came to life in the collection. The simple system flutes, we could join a station from B to low A, were made in nickel silver, and even 18-karat gold. This technology was employed by other Italian makers once the patent rights expired. Double wall instruments remained in Rampone's catalog until the 1930s. This is, for instance, a flute which was previously owned by Leonardo De Lorenzo and was made around 1930. This is silver with full extension to low A. Double wall, of course. Rampone built also a wooden flute covered with metal as a further experiment for assuring protection against the wooden frets, but the instrument was too heavy and was not successful. Giuseppe Barlassina, in the pinless flute, there exists a band system prototype, not completely finished, made around 1900 by Giuseppe Barlassina of Milan, that is a very early example of a pinless keywork with mechanical solutions that much later will be found in the flutes employing the Johann Breger technology. Now, enhancements to the simple system traditional keywork. The most innovative models were the De Michelis system flute, built around 1975 by the brothers Ricci in Rome and in Milan by Agostino Rampone, and the flute Gherardi system. Both consisted on a rearrangement of the Ziegler system of keys with the addition of several keys and a suppression of others. Vincenzo De Michelis wrote also a method for his flute, much appreciated and adopted by teachers because it proved suitable for the use of simple system flute and also for the band flute. The Michelis flute is composed of only two pieces, the head joint with a tuning slide and the body with 13 keys and 4 levers. The keys are positioned on posts and rods and supported by long sleeves. The one-piece body avoids airflow obstacles and allows long connection among the keys that can be placed in the most rational positions. There are 3 keys, there are 3 trill keys, one for the D, one for E, and a double key for the sharp. Levers double close keys and are useful for several trills. The method lists all possible fingerings that include many alternative positions for chromatic scale and for all possible trills. Special attention is devoted to the natural and artificial fingerings for harmonic sounds. The Gherardi system flute, here is a picture, here is the judgment of the flutist famous in Italy, Francesco Squarzoni in 1917 gave for the Gherardi flute. This type of flute is constructed entirely of wood without any contact with metal or cork inside. The bore preserved the shape of the old system flute, and it is only slightly modified in some places in order to facilitate the production of sound, correct intonation, and in balancing the intensity. It has a very good keywork while presenting a simple arrangement of keys. Using 2 lightweight rods in the upper part of the instrument, and on which as many as 6 different events are possible, the player will get many trills and tremolos in middle and high range. This problem of trills and tremolos in Italy was much felt because most of the literature of the time, with virtuoso pieces, they adopted a lot of these ornaments. So many makers aim at introducing new keys just for this purpose. Rampone, simple system concert flute. Alfredo Rampone, the son of Agostino Rampone of Milan, improved the simple system flute in 1898 with the patented introduction of 3 new keys for the right finger that consequently had to control a total of 6 keys. The new holes were placed between the D and E and the B and C tone holes in the upper part of the flute body. The main purpose was to make new trills and tremolos in the high register possible, as required by the virtuoso literature of the time, as I said just a moment ago. Several examples of passages playable by the use of the keys were provided in the advertising pamphlets. This invention met the favor of professional players, and this model became, for a few decades, the favorite Ziegler type of flute in Italy. Now, simple system flutes with keywork derived from Böhm's. The efforts aimed at exploiting the mechanical innovation introduced by Theodor Böhm while preserving the simple system fingerings, a road tried in Italy since the mid-century by Giulio Briccialdi in the late decades of 1800 led to the invention of several alternative models addressed to professional players. These flutes offer different solutions in the number of traditional duplicated and trick keys, but all maintain the traditional closed keys of the simple system flute. The flute at the bottom by Baldassini and Villoro presents the simplest solution, namely independent open keys or the 6 tone holes, and the usual closed keys for the simple system flute, but cylindrical body and parabolic joint. One proposal in particular received a certain market success. It is the so-called pseudo-band flute by Agostino Rampone. Here is an exemplar you can check. In fact, at the first glance, it looks like a band flute, cylindrical body and similar keywork, but it has all the closed keys of the simple system flute and employs its fingerings. It has 3 additional keys for the right index finger, different from the one of the other flute I've been talking before. And it has 3 additional keys for the right index finger that make the execution of several tricks easier. A second model by Luigi, here is another, this is a double wall version of the same pseudo-band flute by Rampone. A second model made by Luigi Vanotti Milan is very similar to the one just mentioned. It has a double-eyed deep 3 tone holes and various additional duplicated keys for alternative fingers. You see, it seems rather complicated arrangement of keys. A third proposal was made by Luigi Baldassino and Alfredo Casoli in Milan around 1900. Differently from the 2 models just reported, this flute has conical boa realized with a double wall technology. The tone holes are smaller than the usual lever flute, and the instrument has a sensibly higher weight. Again, the key mechanism is rather complex, and this flute represents yet another original and well-designed interpretation of an alternative to the band flute. Now, original key mechanism designs for flute. Emilio Lazzari of Florence invented in 1880 a flute with a special mechanism that would allow the production of the chromatic tones by simply pressing a special key with the left hand called the diatonic key. Consequently, the pitch of the lowest open diatonic tone was raised by half a tone by pressing the thumb key. The flute could also be played using the traditional fingerings, avoiding the use of that key. A fingering chart associated to the pattern shows all possible fingering combinations for each tone. The idea of the diatonic key circulated in Italy in that period of time, and the clarinet, based on the same principle, was presented by Primo dell'Argine at the Industrial Parma exhibition in 1887, and later, in 1924, it was patented by Giuseppe Baldassino in Milan with the name of combination clarinet with diatonic key. Carlo Tommaso Giorgi requested 2 patents in March 1888, the first concerning the scientific division of a cylindrical tube for of given diameter and length to obtain the notes of the chromatic scale in tune. This title was application of a scientific division of the musical scale for the wind instruments. It represents an original approach different from the one proposed by Theobald Böhm. The flute, the object of the second patent, and made by applying his theoretical acoustical principles at cylindrical bore, and was realized with the help of Henry Louis Schaffner, a dentist in Florence, with inexperience in making special purpose tools for his profession, and later made by Pupo Popeschi, a maker in Florence. He has, here is on the right, it has rectangular tone holes of decreasing size from the bottom to the top. The key covers are operated by arms that are connected to a set of long lateral rods that run along the body length of the instrument. The flute produced in chromatic scale and had therefore completely different fingerings from those of the simple system of the band system flutes. The same Giorgi in 95 patented a keyless vertical flute. Very likely, the complicated key arrangement of the first model was too complex for reliable employment and hard to maintain and of course very expensive. The scale of this latter model was chromatic, as in the previous one. The keyless configuration was rather difficult to play. One hole was to be closed by the third phalanx of the left index finger, but auxiliary keys could be added to help the execution of some fingers. It was produced by Marinors in Milan with models from none to 11 keys and in large numbers by Joseph Wallace in England. Now, variations and enhancements to the band flute. Pupo Pupeschi of Florence was one of the most innovative Italian makers. He obtained several patents from 1892 to 1924, aimed mainly to the clarinet, but also applied to the flute, oboe and saxophone. The first patent in 1892 had the title New Key Arrangements and Other Mechanism in Wind Instruments, and the following four were just completion patents. His most successful innovation was the new arrangement for the G-sharp key for the flute that became an open key. He suppressed the key touch for the left little finger and had the key was opened by the keys of the right hand. In this way, he claimed he could reduce the number of keys and make some fingers passages smoother. For instance, the trill between F sharp and G sharp. He sold his patent prize to important foreign makers, Mayon, Kohn, Wood and Oaks, Kohler. And this is, for instance, a flute by Kohler with the patent Pupeschi key. In fact, he always paid much attention to the commercial side of his activity. Abelardo Albisi, flute player, inventor and composer, studied flute in the Royal Music School of Parma, where, in the same period, Arturo Toscanini studied cello. They were close friends, and Toscanini, in 1898, wanted Albisi as the first flute in the Scala Theatre Orchestra. He kept that position for several years, but in 1917 he was forced to lead the orchestra after a bitter verbal dispute with Toscanini. Around 1900, Albisi conceived the flute to be played with the left hand only, provided with a handle for the right hand. These instruments are at the Dayton Miller Collection in Washington. He and other composers wrote music for, here is a picture, how to play, and this is the score for this very strange instrument. In 1903, he designed and patented the addition of several keys to the band system flute, realized by Gio and Alfredo Rampone and Gino Bartoli in Milan. The patent title was Band Flute Albisi System. The main enhancements were new keys operated by the right index finger to perform trills beforehand made by the left hand, an auxiliary key for the F sharp, and the key to obtain the natural B without moving the double BB key. He requested a patent, this is the flute, he requested a patent in 1910 for the baritone Albisi flute. According to many composers, he states, there was the need for an instrument able to complete the flute family in the low register. The albisiphone was made in the alto and baritone sizes, the latter being a bass flute an octave lower than the ordinary flute, and the former a fifth lower. The albisiphone was held vertically and at a T-shaped joint with the lip plate at the center of an horizontal segment. It was built initially in the workshop of Luigi Vanotti in Milan and later by other makers. The flute was quite successful and was requested by several composers, for instance by Mascagni in La Parisina, 1913, and Zandonai and Melenis. Dayton Miller, here is the picture, loved to play this flute. In the same period, flutes in high G and F, of an intermediate size between the concert and the piccolo flutes, were realized and conceived for special effects as requested by composers. The G flute was called the Nightingale and requested by Pietro Mascagni. Here is another proposal. Egidio and Alfredo Ramponi in 1901 patented a radical modification of the band system key arrangement with the addition of new keys and changed the function of others. The patent was for the band flute Ramponi system. The open IC key became a closed key, and the BBB arrangement for the left thumb was radically modified. Their purpose was to allow the positions of the simple system flute, with the exception of the F and F sharp notes, in the first two octaves, plus to facilitate the production of several tremolos and trills. The model received a certain success, and a few exemplars exist. Here is an image. Okay. Conclusions. The new models invented by Theobald Bain in 1832 and in 1847 had a profound impact on the world of flute makers and players, and its acceptance was low in most nations, even bitterly opposed in Italy, where the simple system flute, 11 keys and the B foot, was the preferred and dominant model for most of the 19th century. But the evident advantages of the new mechanical improvements, key arrangement, intonation, sound volume, etc., stimulated the search for compromise solutions which would maintain the traditional fingerings while exploiting features of the main models. But also attempts were made to improve the performances in technical handling of the simple system flute, which resulted in the addition of keys, namely for making some difficult trills possible, or rearrangement of others. Many variations of this latter theme were realized, and a few were described above. The impact of some invention was quite remarkable, and some models were adopted by performers and musical institutions, such as the Bricialdi system flutes, or requested by composers, as was the case of the Bisiphone. Other improvements obtained a positive market response. For instance, the key arrangements invented by Puteschi or the set of 3 keys of Rampone. Also, technological improvements, namely the double wall manufacturing technique patented by Agostino Rampone in 1879, were widely employed in the construction of instruments by the same Rampone, and once the patent was no longer valid, by a number of other makers up to the years 1930s. Other inventions gained popularity because the instruments were produced in large numbers, even if their effective use in music was very limited. I refer here to some of the Georgi model flutes that were made in ebonite and were very cheap. But in the case of many other patents, no exemplar is actually known, and the inventions had no sensible impact on music and were soon forgotten or even completely ignored by performers. In conclusion, I try to include in a comprehensive, even if necessary, concise and not complete picture, the most relevant innovations in flute making in Italy during the 19th century and early 20th century. All this with the aim and the hope of letting the Italian production of flutes better known to performers and scholars. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. This was a perfect example of an instrument in transition. Only in Italy, a wide range of different solutions. Any questions, comments to Francesco?
Thank you, Francesco. I'm overwhelmed by all these different systems. I didn't realize that there are so many, and there are still so many to discover.
There are more.
Yes, I can imagine, and I would love to try them out and to see what are really the advantages.
That's what I hope, because as I told you, I cannot play difficult passages, so I cannot understand really the advantage of some configuration. If somebody wants, I will be very glad. Okay.
I will come to you.
Yeah, sure.
And try all of them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Any others? not, let's come to something completely different. Thank you again, Francesco, and this is really an invitation to visit Francesco in Pisa and his collection. Now I'm muted, but I think you can hear me. Our next speaker is again somebody who needs no introduction, weil kommt aus Basel, ist, wie wir gestern gehört haben, einer der Kristallisationspunkte für diese Veranstaltungen, einer der Schuldigen sozusagen. Flutist in Basel, er sammelt, er forscht über Flöten, er ist Herausgeber der Clariana, der Zeitschrift der GEFAM. Now it's working? Okay. Herausgeber der Clariana, und er hat ein Thema vorgeschlagen für heute, einen ganz anderen Aspekt, nämlich der Frage der Stimmung in einem ganz weiten und ganz engen Sinne zugleich. Und bitte.
Thank you. So I feel guilty already at the beginning. When the outlines of this Congress began to gain a recognizable structure, many things were uncertain, and it was not clear the when, the where, the if, finally. But one thing for me always was clear, the talk I wanted to give here. My idea was to realize something I had in mind since the early days of my modern flute studies in the late Bronze Age. And what I wanted to do is finally to have an argument with the late Mr. Theobald Böhm. I wanted to tell him everything I felt was a step in the wrong direction, and which things he omitted too early. And but after beginning to collect some materials about this struggle with Mr. Böhm, my melody softened a bit in a way of a mild, probably he couldn't help it. And the reason why I became so mild was a passionate love affair I was having those days with Samuel Clemens, alias Mark Twain. And it was chiefly one book, probably you know it, A Yankee in King Arthur's Court, published in 1889, which induced me to soften down and not to fight against Mr. Böhm. To make a long story short, after a violent blow to the head, an engineer of Twain's time, imagine a guy like Theobald Böhm, probably, a Yankee from Connecticut, wakes up lying on a blooming meadow in England, more precisely at Camelot, 13 centuries back in time. And after overcoming some initial problems and after having become the main consultant of King Arthur, he does what he always did. He begins to change his environment according to his ideas. With some pupils carefully trained by himself, he step by step creates a kind of late 19th century parallel world within the 6th century kingdom of King Arthur. Quote, "The telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, the typewriter, the sewing machine, and all the 1,000 willing and handy servants of steam and electricity were working their way into favor," unquote. But Mark Twain's aim is a more serious one. What he wants to show is why his thought experiment has to fail utterly. Why eventually the Empire Strikes Back and undoes all those handy inventions despite of their obvious usefulness. The main reason is a rather simple one. The different mental environments either favor or hinder certain technologies. Technologies are more deeply embedded in social circumstances than we usually realize. In Twain's words, quote, "Training is all there is to a person. All that is original in us can be covered up and hidden by the point of a needle. All the rest being atoms contributed by and inherited from a procession of ancestors," unquote. What Mark Twain explores is a phenomenon which nowadays social psychology knows as framing. In the humanities sector, the investigation of these social, technical, and mental frameworks is known as contextualization. And surely one may feel reminded of the famous quote, "Existence determines consciousness," by Karl Marx. Those references outline more or less what I want to do during the next half hour. I'd like to take a closer look on the framing of the one-keyed flute on the one hand side and of the Böhm flute on the other side. My aim is a rough draft of a contextualization of the changes of the flute that the flute underwent during the period in question. And because framing and contextualization here in the first place means musical framing and contextualization, we should start with a closer look on a segment of musical theory which is particularly relevant for instrument makers. Sorry, I can't help you. We have to talk about musical theory. If you asked 17th or 18th century's theorist, say Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg, about the exact positions of tones and the structure of our tonal system and the dimensions of intervals and things like that, you regularly got answers like, and please don't try to read it and don't try to understand it. The answers were like that. And you'll agree that leaves us in the fog. Those collections literally show thousands of fractions pinned up like beetles in a showcase, and the writer keeps silence about their origin. The musician at that point normally turns round and avoids any further contact with the matter. And so does the instrument maker, I presume. Fortunately, there is help. As on many other occasions, from Leonhard Euler, the great Swiss mathematician who happened to have grown up just a few kilometers north from here, in Rien. In fact, every Swiss had to deal with Mr. Euler on a day-to-day basis. In his 1733 text De Harmoniae Veris Principiis per Speculum Musicum Representatis, he provides us with a very effective navigation equipment on the endless ocean of tone relations. The idea is as simple as Euler's ideas regularly are. It's a coordinate system. It's built by very simple rules. If you start from the center C, every ascending fifth is written to the right on the gray bar, and every descending fifth is written to the left. So we get an endless series of fifths. But after 4 fifths, we reach an E, which unfortunately is unusable. It doesn't work at all. What we need is a different E, which is much lower. And unfortunately, it's not represented in this horizontal bar. So what we need is this E, and this is the beginning of a second axis, the y-axis, vertically. So the ascending thirds are written above, and the descending ones are written below. So every tone you ever could imagine, you can encounter in this coordinate system. And by simply adding the respective fractions, we now can solve the riddle of the thousands and thousands of fractions we get from Mr. Marburg, Mr. Matheson, and so on. If, for example, we imagine the interval C, A sharp, it clearly is the addition of 3 fifths and 3 thirds. If we go, whether we go C, G, D, F sharp, A sharp, or whether we go C, E, G sharp, D sharp, A sharp, doesn't matter, and we reach a certain fraction. Now all we have to do is to look up the given fraction from Mr. Marburg, from Mr. Matheson, and to locate it within this system, and we know the harmonic way the respective author has taken to reach his fraction. And I did it for an example. It is from Marburg, I think. And he makes a combination of 12 tones and gives the respective distances from the starting point, and that the circles are the respective tones in the tone net, how Euler calls his coordinate system that derive from the fractions in the Klanggeschlecht. So those fractions obviously refer to the principal instrument used in musical theory until the 19th century, the monochord. Euler's tone nets just simplifies and visualizes the system of dealing with tones and intervals which was in use from Pythagoras' time through the 16th century, at least to the end of 18th century. This is from Matheson, der vollkommene Kapellmeister. What Euler unintentionally showed was the infinite abundance of solitary fractions is integrated into a comprehensive network. So every interval we could play, we could imagine, we could compose is a path within this coordinate system. And every melody could be described as a movement within this underlying matrix. From this point of view, Euler, in a way, spoke the last word on the system that can be traced down 2,500 years back to Pythagoras. Nevertheless, this genius system turned out to be a kind of historical joke. He published it in 1774, at the very time when the musical world started to forget all about this way of thinking. The German author Kurt Tucholsky apparently was right when he wrote, "The great questions of mankind are not being solved but forgotten." As we all know, music theory since the 19th century uses the keyboard instead of the monochord as a medium for experiment and illustration. The American musicologist Alexander Redding condensed this basic change into the formula of change of the epistemic instrument. This change has a lot of consequences. The monochord is able to demonstrate every interval easily and with precision, but you can't hardly play any tune on it. The keyboard, on the other hand, lets you play any tune without effort, but it hides the actual relations of notes and the dimensions of the resulting intervals. Each key of the keyboard can enter into direct relation with any other key without thinking about complicated relations. Or using an expression of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, those tones are freed from their chains. But as I see some yawning, I think it's time to speak about the flute. Well, I skip the Renaissance flute where everything is even worse. And I start with the one-keyed flute, which entered the musical market at some time between 1670 and the mid-1680s. Unfortunately, flute makers do not talk or write much about what they are doing and how they do it, with the one famous exception of Theobald Böhm. But when you try to tune your first one-keyed flute, you inevitably get the idea. When you start to make one-keyed flutes, you will find it quite irritating that you can tune literally nothing without altering something else. Whatever you do, the side effects are manifold and sometimes difficult to anticipate. What you see here is the ordinary range of the one-keyed flute, something like 2.5 octaves. In this table, the basic fingerings are marked by fermatas in the bass line. The second line are the octaves, and the third register is up in the in the top line. What you cannot see in this table are some preconditions which the flute maker set beforehand. He defined the exact tuning of the octaves by balancing chord position and the taper of the inner bore. He defined many halftones by positioning the fingerholes. But when he starts to tune his flute, this is what happens. If he, for instance, wants to tune the A of the first octave a bit higher, marked by the red circle, he has to widen the respective hole a little bit. This makes the A higher, but the A of the second octave becomes even much higher depending on the taper of the flute's bore. At the same time, the fork fingerings that depend on this hole drift upwards. And working on an enharmonic instrument, he has not only to keep in mind the A flat, but the G sharp. And the same applies to the second octave. In the third octave, at the same time, the E3 begins to drift away, hopefully in a position where he likes it. Additionally, the F3 begins to change its sound color and its stability. It speaks more or less easily depending on the size of the A hole, even if its tuning is defined by another hole. The same happens to B flat 2 of the second octave and the B of the second octave. Even the C of the second octave is affected by tempering with this A hole. Indeed, you will agree that it's one of the great miracles that flute makers are not generally highly depressive and at the verge of suicide. If you see all the relations they have to deal with by tuning a one-keyed flute. Tuning a one-keyed flute feels a bit like organizing a party for a copious and impulsive family. Whatever you do, you trigger a multitude of different relations and dependencies. So you see, the maker of one-keyed flute is dealing with a network. That's a maker of a one-keyed flute. The 5 or more keyed flute in that respect is a kind of hybrid. It basically is a one-keyed flute. Imagine this network fuzzily behind this graphics. What I said here is only the key tones. So in the basic line, every note is a basic fingering with an open key. That means all tones now can have more or less identical conditions. Every note of the chromatic scale has its own individual tone hole. So if a client likes any note higher or lower, the maker is more or less free to tune this note and its octave at will. He only has to deal with the respective hole, and he can be sure not to damage anything else. The respective tones are atomized, like the tones of the piano. The Böhm flute simplifies the flute constructor's life even more, at least in that respect. For clarity's sake, I only show the range of the old flute here. So the modern flute doesn't stop at A3, as we all know. It follows the principle of one task, one tool, which is still alive in modern software programming. Now practically every tone has its individual tone hole. It's completely atomized. Every tone can be tuned individually. There is no one-keyed flute network behind. There are very few relations a flute maker has to bear in mind. For example, that the third octave, the E and the higher notes have a kind of relation with their lower 12th, because they are more or less 2 times overblown. So as Bart yesterday said, it's a kind of blowing piano. Please allow me to complete this overview with some completely uncompleted thoughts. When we think back to my examples from the times before the 19th century, for example, Mark Twain's book, and its colorful picture of a pre-modern society like this. When we think back to Euler's tone net, and when we think back to the hideous task of tuning one-keyed flutes, I see some striking similarities. In all of those systems, the actual position of every point, its meaning, and eventually its value is dependent on its relation to a multitude of other points. In other words, every point is part of a pre-existing network. In musical theory, as we saw before, any tone is the result of a certain genealogy. So F sharp is 2/5 from C and 1/3 above. No interval is imaginable without the underlying matrix of dependency. That is more or less what we all learned in oral training. The design of one-keyed flutes, every possible tone is determined by a plethora of prerequisites. In pre-19th centuries societies, everybody had his place in life from the day of his birth. He was the member of a certain church, he was subject to a certain duke, subject of a certain king, heir of a long ago founded workshop, and after some time he becomes a member of a certain guild, and so on and so on. And if we talk about women in this time, things were even much simpler. All those relations define the life quite completely. When you visit cities which are built in this time on the green field ground without a pre-existing city, you find sometimes urbanistic symbols of this idea. For example, Karlsruhe, 200 kilometers to the north. As you see, every location in the center, every street and every house is defined by its position to a given center. Like every tone in Euler's tone net is defined by its position to the center C. One of the central ideas of the early 19th century was to get rid of those limitations. This, as we all know, was more or less the very motto of the French Revolution. That's why I put the well-known picture of the Revolution at the very beginning of my talk. Liberté and égalité were doubtless the first and strongest demands. Fraternité, as we all know, only made a respectable third place. Everybody from now on should have the same chance to develop from kitchen boy to millionaire, or worst case, from entertainer to president. Relations between the members of the society, well, theoretically, should depend on what a person achieved on its own. The parallels in music are obvious. It is sufficient to refer to ideas like Schönberg's composition with 12 tones only related to each other, or successors like Alois Haber, Ivan Wisnegradsky, Viktor Ullmann and others. Only related to each other. You can't put the idea more precisely. The habit of solving problems in an atomized way transposes this way of thinking into the field of technique. You have a problem with the malaria in Europe? Well, drain the swamps. You have a problem making enough clothes? Well, sewing machine helps you. Toasters are invented, cars and mobile phones produced in mass production were made affordable for more or less everybody. Power plants blurred the boundaries between day and night. Artificial fertilizers enabled an increase of food production that allowed a good portion of food to be thrown away. Building railway lines linked formerly separated regions and facilitated journeys and transport over vast distances. In the early 20th century, universities, it's no joke, advised young people not to study natural sciences because nearly all existing problems have been solved and there were hardly anything more to learn. That worked remarkably well, at least for a while, say 1.5 centuries. But one day, mankind began to realize that our planet, in technical terms, is a network, whether we like the idea or not. Many of our actions turned out to be interwoven in cross-connections of sometimes planetary dimensions. Be it that we throw away a plastic bottle, or that we eat a well-done steak, or that we drive to next town for shopping. Again, we find ourselves entangled in networks. All the worse, those networks are manifoldly cross-linked networks, whose extent and functionality all too often is only partly understood. Again, the situation changed. We learned that whatever we do, we have to bear in mind a multitude of predefined conditions and consequences. One of the loudest alarm clocks for this awakening process rang in 1972, when the Club of Rome proclaimed the catchy formula of the limits to growth. The book was introduced during a congress in St. Gallen, 160 kilometers east from here. Only 17 years later, in 1989, and only just 250 kilometers southwest from here in Geneva, somehow Switzerland is a remarkable country. A young guy called Tim Berners-Lee started the engine and set up the ultimate paradigma for the new way of thinking, the internet, the World Wide Web. The 1990s, on the other hand, were the very years when not only the interest for old flutes, but the whole network of musicology and art, called historically informed performance praxis, gained public dimensions, and again Switzerland played its role, this time Basel and the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis. Now, was it the upcoming paradigma of holistic thinking instead of atomized solutions, which made it possible to see the old flute no longer as an old and imperfect instrument, but as a reminder for a holistic way of thinking. To prevent a natural misunderstanding, this shall not at all imply that we today are simply reproducing thought patterns of the 18th century. On the contrary, in a way, right now and here, I'm demonstrating what the fundamental difference is. We discuss those predetermined networks, we study them, we try to deal with them in the best possible way, whatever best means. We don't accept them as a divine law, given once and for all. We feel free to act, but we know quite well which step could tear the net apart. Bearing all that in mind, our language regulation, like modern flute and old flute, for me seems a bit anachronistic in itself. Both instruments are out of date in their respective way. The networking old system flute, as well as its atomized new system Böhm successor. Before anybody now feels offended, the conical diatonic flute was 150 years of age when Böhm, around 1830, felt the strong necessity for a new system flute. And since Böhm's time until today, 190 years elapsed. Which only leaves me with the question about the genuine modern flute of our time. Thank you.
Thank you. Something completely different. Any comments, questions?
All the better.
All the better. However, thank you. It was inspiring, and that means it takes some time to settle down, and we will have, after the next talk, a coffee break, and then you can ask or fight with Jörg about his thoughts. The next speakers are two speakers, and I'm afraid we have a mistake. We should put your presentation on the other computer, because I have to join now the other speaker, which is sitting in Manchester, I think. And so we need a few seconds to organize.
But this one I can. Oh, yes. Hi, Gavin. Oh. Hello, fine. You're here. We have just installed the PowerPoint. One second, I just need to change the speakers to. Is Preston this machine? I don't know. I think it is. Okay. Yeah, which is here.
Morning.
So everybody's seen everything. How do I, sorry, I don't speak German.
This is no problem.
How do I do this?
Just here, here. But I think we so that he should be on the screen as well. And I should.
How do I,
Just what can you see here?
okay.
Just
Can I turn it off the presenter mode?
the normal.
Yeah.
If you can. No, this is wrong. Yeah, because you can see it here. You don't like this. Can you see it?
This is not from the beginning. And then
Yes,
do I right click on it?
but you don't want to see this one.
Or will this work? Like this?
Actually, task cards. Sorry, I can't.
No, it's fine.
It's right.
Oh, that works.
That works.
And when I get to the sound file,
Should work. The sound file should work here as well. We just need to
Yeah.
inform you.
Make sure that your colleague can be heard.
so how do I, if normally I just click on it, I'm just wondering how I do this.
Can you say something that?
I can.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Fine.
Great. Hello. Thanks for setting all that up.
Martin is starting now.
Wonderful.
Now we are reaching the next level of technological problem solving. We have now a presentation by Martin Shaw. You can see it here, Leeds Conservatoire, and Gavin Wade, who is online. You can't see it at the moment here, but you will see him afterwards via Zoom. It's going about St. Nicholson's improved flute and a new way of dealing with this instrument. So we will have, I think, a presentation of the historical instrument, its context, but something else, what we can do with this knowledge and this instrument nowadays. And it leads us from the 19th century to the 21st century, which I found a wonderful exploration of this topic. Martin is teaching, as you can see, Leeds Conservatoire as a musician, as a flute player, but he wrote his dissertation on Charles Nicholson flutes in Nicholsonian effect. I think this was the title of CD, Relief Music, of Nicholson's instrument Aspects of Tone in early 19th century performance practice in England, in Birmingham in 2014, and Gavin Wade, his colleague in Manchester, is a composer. And this relation explains already a little bit what will happen now. Please, Martin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to first tell you a little bit about our broader project, Early 19th Century Musical Innovation as a Catalyst for Interdisciplinary Collaboration. So during the pandemic, whilst barriers to music making have engendered new approaches to collaboration, there remain challenges in maintaining the necessary levels of creativity to continue to develop the field. Embedded within the social and aesthetic fabric, we seek to discover new ways of collaborating in the present day. We ask how interdisciplinary collaboration in the present may be developed. What artistic result will fusing the past and the present produce? Might a window on the past add a further dimension to collaborative practice as a catalyst for the future? Gavin discusses this in great detail later on, but for now we'll turn to one of the central figures in our research together, Charles Nicholson. A particular focus of our collaboration is the work of Nicholson, whose collaborative engagement as a flautist, composer and contributor to instrumental design was influential in his lifetime and continues into the present day. Nicholson composed over 50 works for the flute, and his association with every London orchestra and appointment as the royal flautist to King William IV illustrate his elevated status as a performer. Nicholson was appointed the first flute professor at the Royal Academy of Music at its inception in 1822. In the present day, Nicholson is widely acknowledged for his significant contribution to flute design, and most notably his influence upon Böhm's design of the modern flute through the Nicholson's improved flute. Famously, Böhm writes in his memoirs, "I did as well as any continental flautist in London in 1831, but I could not match Nicholson in power of tone. Wherefore I set to rework my flute. Had I not heard him, probably the Böhm flute would never have been made." Nicholson endorsed flutes were produced by Thomas Prowse initially for the Clementi Company. There were around 4,500 Nicholson flutes produced between 1820 and 1845. The instrument is an adapted 8-keyed simple system instrument with a typical conical bore and metal-lined head joint. As far as we can ascertain, all legitimate Nicholson-endorsed flutes were produced by Thomas Prowse Sr. and his eldest son, Thomas Jr. They were made initially by Clementi, for whom Prowse worked until 1831, when Maurizio Clementi retired a year before his death. Although there were 6 partners in the business, Clementi & Co., it's thought that Prowse Sr. was the sole maker involved in the production of Nicholson's improved flutes. Production continued in an interim period by Clementi's partners Collard and Collard until Prowse Jr. announced the establishment of his own manufactory in the Times in 1834. It's not known the extent to which Nicholson contributed to Prowse's design, although it was said to be based upon Nicholson's own adapted Astor flute. A broadside for Thomas Prowse, however, suggests quite a hands-on approach, as you can see. Whether, as the broadside suggests, Nicholson attended the workshop to try every flute daily would seem quite a tall order. The Nicholson flute, which I'm using in our collaboration, was made in London in 1839. It's made from rosewood. Thus, the Nicholson flute provides a direct link to the past. Nicholson's innovations in performance practice and composition include an appetite for developing a palette of new flute techniques. And as the Nicholson flute was designed specifically around Nicholson's own performance practice, it forms a central focus to our collaboration as an inspiration for innovation in our own work. Our aim is to place Nicholson's work as central to musical, stylistic, and collaborative decisions within the pieces that we create together. I'll next turn to 3 expressive ornaments in Nicholson's performance practice before illustrating these in performance. Firstly, vibration. In early 19th century England, vibrato was generally referred to as vibration. Definitions of vibration include in a bold, heroic style, with a strong vibrating quality of sound, and with much vibration of tone. Whilst most modern flautists execute vibrato using only the breath, Nicholson's approach to vibration was far more diverse. He executed it by using the air, the fingers, the hands, and through the use of key work. I'll now briefly explain each of these in turn. Nicholson recommends an even motion of the air, describing a regular swell and modulation of the breath, with some similitude to a state of exhaustion or panting, and with a regular decrease or diminution of the tone. His contemporaries Alexander, Bone, and Lindsay describe a tremulous or panting motion of the breath. Finger vibrato. Based on its presence in tutors, finger vibrato, or sweetenings as it was known in England, declined in use in the second half of the 18th century. It saw something of a resurgence in the 19th century when Nicholson reintroduced it to England in 1816. Finger vibration appears in Nicholson's vibration scales, published in 1816 and 1836, notated here using a wavy line and indicated with half of the finger hole covered, or a dash through the circle. There are 2 ways of executing finger vibration. The first method involves the movement of the finger over the hole without actually coming into contact with it. In the second method, the finger repeatedly covers and uncovers half of the hole, as used generally in the practice of flattement. The advent of key vibration was linked with the development of improved key design. Key vibration is closely related to finger vibration in the sense that both involve a manipulation of the tone holes. The effect, however, is quite different. Finger vibration produces an oscillation in the pitch. Whereas key vibration alters the actual tone colour. Nicholson indicates it by specifying the key that he wants the player to use, shown with a wavy line. So in this example, with the red arrow, the D sharp key, you can see, is indicated. The final type of vibration is made using the hands to shake the instrument. Here he indicates breath vibration using an accent sign and a wavy line to represent hand vibration. Nicholson explains, when the vibration becomes too rapid to continue the effect of the breath, a tremulous motion must be given to the flute with the right hand, the lips being perfectly relaxed and the tone subdued to a mere whisper. The following is an example where the vibration is produced by the breath. At the commencement of the semiquavers, the tremulous motion of the flute will be requisite. Nicholson's use of variety in tone quality forms an important aspect of his performance practice. The relationship between music and colour was well established in England by the early 19th century. Several English writers discuss the relationship between painting and music, most notably Joshua Reynolds and William Crotch. Both share the view that music may be considered in reference to other art forms in order to illustrate good taste. This connection is especially evident in an article that appeared in the English journal Quarterly Musical Magazine and Review in 1818, in which the colour sky blue was attributed directly to the flute. Nicholson was particularly renowned for his use of varied tones in his playing, perhaps most famously by Welsh, who wrote that Nicholson could elicit every variety of tone which the flute was capable of producing. But what were these different tones? In my research, I've identified 4 specific tone colours used by flautists in early 19th century England. Here's a spectral analysis of each tone colour using a low G played on the Nicholson flute, illustrating the fundamental on the left of each image, followed by the strength of each subsequent harmonic. Below each are the instructions given in tutor books for producing each of the tone colours. So I'll illustrate that now. Sans clair. Natural. Some plein. And metallic. Next we turn to one of the ornaments that Nicholson was best known for, the glide. Such was Nicholson's repute for applying glides in performance that Rockstro credits him as the inventor. The glide is introduced by Nicholson in 1816 as an ornament of expression which involves a sweet swelling gradation into the tone. This is echoed by several other English writers of the period, including Alexander, who reflects the glide gives true pathos to a performance which never fails to reach the heart. Notated glides appear throughout Nicholson's compositional output. In all 3 of his tutors, glides are usually formed of just 2 notes in an ascending pattern. They may, however, ascend, descend, or do a mixture of both and can be formed of up to 5 notes. They are often combined with other ornaments, including appoggiaturas, turns, and also with vibration. I'm now going to pass over to Gavin, who places this within the context of our collaboration together.
Thank you, Martin, and hello, everybody. It's a real honour to be part of the conference today, and thank you for everyone who's helped set up all this technology. So in collaborating with Martin, I'm joining a rapidly growing roster of composers working with musicians from historically informed practice. And many of the historical performance groups around the world have regular composer collaborations and programs. So on this next slide, we have a few examples. We have Rebecca Saunders' Rubricare, where instrumental timbres are explored under a microscope. Michel van der Aar's imprint, which supercharges the string section of the Freiburg Baroque Orchestra, and Thomas Adès' Sonata da Caccia, offering ubiquitous ornamentation in a surreal, soft focus, Stravinskian neoclassicist vein. There are numerous examples of single instrument collaborations, the basset horn and basset clarinet being popular among these, as well as many instances of new compositions for Baroque flute, for instance, Oliver Searle's Faith, Hopes and Charity. I'll play you extracts from each of those pieces now, and I should say that the first two pieces here are performed by the Freiburg Baroque Orchestra. The Adès is the EMI recording with the composer at the harpsichord, and the Oliver Searle is performed by Carla Rees. Thank you. Thank you. So it's fair to say that collaborating with historically informed performers is a thriving subset of contemporary compositional activity. Now let's turn our attention to soliloquy. Soliloquy is a short piece for solo flute, dialoguing with elements of Charles Nicholson's Roslin Castle. Roslin Castle shows written out ornaments and embellishments and is used as an indicator of the Nicholson style, which itself was a strong influence on the English style of flute playing, as discussed by Ardell Powell. This is of particular interest to me as an outmoded style of playing, having been overtaken by a French-influenced manner in the 20th century, and evokes the general notion of obsolescence in music, which will be touched upon later in this paper. To provide a brief background to our collaboration so far, we've been collaborating in a focused way for around 18 months, communicating through video calls and shared online documents during the pandemic. We still haven't worked together in a studio space due to ongoing factors in the use of space post-pandemic, but we're hopeful this will be possible in the coming months. The basic premise for our collaboration is to develop music using the Nicholson flute with electronics. One of the first areas of development for us was aspects of tone connected to the Nicholson flute, which I had taken to be about tone color and, by extension, the manipulation and development of tone color through electronics. In the early part of our collaboration, I would develop short examples of, say, a simple flute tone gaining extra color by being passed through electronic effects, or of time stretching and manipulating recordings made by Martin to produce evolving sound textures. We use these short examples to establish an oral starting point for the collaboration, so our ears could guide us in our exploration, as well as any extra musical motivations. I'll play you a recording now of the prelude we produced for the Noise Floor Festival at Staffordshire University in the UK in May 2021. I'll briefly mention a point which is fundamental to our collaboration, and that is Martin's expertise in improvisation. Towards the beginning of our collaboration, I had produced an audio file on software using a sampled flute and had manipulated some of the notes with effects to develop their tone colour, as I've just discussed. I'd sent Martin this audio recording for him to share his views on it with me. However, in our subsequent conversation, he gently mentioned that not only had he listened to the piece, he had actually picked up his flute and had improvised along with it, which he offered to demonstrate. He showed he is wholly adept at improvising in a contemporary musical language. This actually radically changed our direction of work, as it showed that there was little by the way of barriers to the musical collaboration we could have. So we were able to start working with a contemporary tonal language and performance style straight away, with Martin bringing along his historically informed playing style and sensibility, totally unhindered. We can listen to the prelude now. So what you've just heard is the final version of the prelude, which involved a layered production process. The first stage was recording Martin playing the composed layer you can see on the screen, with the original version of the live electronics being played to him on headphones so he could hear the electronics being applied live to his playing. Then we recorded his improvisation, coordinating with the composed layer and effects. There then followed a post-production stage that I undertook involved refining the electronics so they did not smother the flute layers. This was especially important because at the moment this piece only exists as a recording. If it is played live, the electronics will not obscure the live playing half as much because of the separation of the live performer and the loudspeakers. However, on a recording, it is harder to distinguish the composed flute layer and Martin's improvised layer. So it's necessary to reduce the amount of electronic effects and to rebalance the dynamic levels in the recording. I'll just play you the first system again, where you can hear composed, electronic, and improvised layers. All of this itself raises other issues to do with the performance style of the music we are producing, taking into account the practical needs of live performance as opposed to how the music might sound on a recording, and whether there needs to be different versions for a live performance and a recorded performance. Regarding today's discussion, one of the biggest influences the first collaboration had was to show the different kinds of dialogues that were emerging in our work. A primary dialogue appeared between me and the Nicholson period itself. The composed part in the prelude is based on a single inverted dominant seventh chord. Thus, the seed for the prelude comes from a typical tonal sonority, though the flowering of that seed is identifiably 21st century. The style of the prelude comes from a further dialogue between me and Martin and Nicholson's music in general, building on the preluding technique for which he was famous. There was a literal dialogue between Martin and myself from working together over the internet. And there is the audible dialogue between Martin's improvisation and the composed music. Now I'll hand over to Martin to talk some more about Nicholson's Roslin Castle.
Thank you, Gavin, hundreds of miles away. It's very clear. As Gavin has already mentioned, Rosslyn Castle is the inspiration behind soliloquy. Rosslyn Castle was a popular broadside ballad composed by Richard Hewitt of Cumberland, secretary to the Scottish poet Thomas Blacklock. I'm going to next perform the first of Nicholson's settings of Rosslyn Castle, published in Preceptive Lessons in 1821. This is a very clear example of Nicholson's own performance practice, since the footnote reads, "The embellishments, etc., are exactly as he performed them." Nicholson notates glides and vibration in this performance in order to maintain the practice of illustrating good taste. Based on the aesthetic qualities described in tutors and sources of the period. Sans-cuir, charming, soft, sweet and delicious, natural, graceful, tender and melodious, sans-plaine, reedy, mellow and astonishing, and metallic, firm, brilliant, powerful and warlike. The four types of vibration differ in execution and effect. Finger vibration is largely concerned with a fluctuation in pitch, which falls below the pitch of the note. Key vibration and hand vibration cause an alteration in tone colour with minimal change in pitch. Breath vibration, on the other hand, changes both the colour and pitch of the note. I apply breath vibration to add accentuation and hand vibration for intensity. Finger vibration causes dissonance, whilst key vibration can emphasize through coloration. back to Gavin now, hopefully.
Thank you, Martin. So now I'll develop the discussion of soliloquy. In some ways, I composed soliloquy with a sense of tabula rasa. I wanted to take another step forward in the Nicholson project. I wanted to create a new piece which would, like the previous piece, create momentum in the project and serve as a future source of ideas and material for a bigger future composition. So I stripped back my resources, deciding not to use electronics, but to compose only onto paper and to create a standalone piece for solo flute, a dialogue between a handful of core musical precepts related to my understanding of Nicholson's music and my own musical intentions. Soliloquy also maintains the spirit of dialogue with the Nicholson flute and the performance style begun in the prelude last May. It is the first of my pieces to engage directly with an actual composition by Nicholson. I wanted to thread some of Nicholson's musical material through my own composition. This manifests as the notes of Roslin Castle melody being positioned at various points in the upper register to create a cognitive connection for the listener, a flicker of recognition of the tune, but separated by my own musical material. The idea was that my own music puts Nicholson's melody under the spotlight by undermining its tonal implications, for example, and disassociating the individual melody notes from their texture, and so on. Soliloquy is less about transformation of musical ideas than in earlier sketches, and more of a kind of exploration, provocation, or even interrogation of the possibilities of how I could work with Nicholson's actual music, the performance style, and the Nicholson flute. This is a test for how far I can push things expressively, moving towards extremes in the high register, and having passages of music where there is an emotional release, a breaking free from the main locus of engagement with the Roslin Castle material. Soliloquy resides on a tonal disjunct between the original key of Roslin Castle and the focal pitches of my composition. Roslin Castle is in the key of F, so I began the melody on the note F, but overall this means the key of D minor is outlined. By implication, therefore, there is an a priori conflict between Nicholson's composition and my own. Contrasting with these kind of tonal tensions, much of soliloquy is actually based on archetypal figurations of the like found in Nicholson's popular tutor book and the source of Roslin Castle, The Preceptive Lessons for the Flute, published in 1821. Charles Nicholson was renowned, and not always favourably, for his virtuosic runs between registers, and these feature strongly in soliloquy. On the slide you can see a typical two-part figuration and examples of runs. Material matters aside, I wanted to build the Nicholson playing style into the piece. In particular, I wanted to engage with the ad libitum notion within the playing style. Ad libitum is a phrase that occurs in the Nicholson Preceptive Lessons where he writes, and I quote, "The more ad libitum the embellishments to the above beautiful melody are played, the better will be the effect. Let the pupil, however, be careful that the air is strictly preserved." The air referred to here is what is named as an Irish melody. In performances of Roslin Castle in the current day, I am particularly struck by how much room is given to the ornaments and embellishments, in particular once the main melody has been introduced. In fact, there is so much room given to embellishments that the written notation of the music frequently does not resemble the oral manifestation in performance, to the extent that for extended passages, the music feels unmetered. This connects strongly with current day approaches to meter and time, which can vary from fluidity to strictness. This also reminds me of some of Stockhausen's experiments with ornaments and embellishments, grace notes in particular, such that the physical actions needed to perform grace notes, which are sometimes in extremes of register, actually impede the regular flow of time. I'm talking about the period around Clavistuck numbers 5 to 10, a 10-year gap from the early 1950s. So here we have groups of grace notes functioning as embellishments, distorting the structure of the surrounding music. As British composer Jonathan Harvey puts it, the grace notes, which exist independently of the tempo, have their own scale of speeds, depending on how awkward they are to play clearly. This kind of effect relates to the well-known rubato style of Chopin, where, say, a nocturne may be crammed with embellishments, but in some sense the time expands and contracts around them, Certainly more than in the performances of Nicholson, where things sound much more like a displacement of notes rather than a Chopinesque borrowing of time. So it is much more the inserting of embellishments which actually take up a structural position within the score which attracted me, and is something I incorporated into soliloquy. There are no composed embellishments as such, but there is a sense of musical phrases which might otherwise be played consecutively being separated by contrasting material before being allowed to continue. This kind of interplay, or wrestling for control of the musical discourse, contributes to the sense of dialogue in the music. I mentioned earlier Martin's improvisational skills, and while there are no composed elements on the score, Martin has added typical Nicholson ornaments at various points, and in one instance we actually changed some of the composed notes to allow the ornaments to be incorporated and have their full effect. This is typical of our collaboration, taking the score as a starting point for music making and not viewing it as a rigid entity to be reproduced in performance. Turning our attention away from the score and away from the performance of soliloquy, one of the broader areas of concern to me and Martin at the moment is the notion of time and obsolescence. We're still in the discovery stage of our collaboration, so ideas are still formulating and developing with each step we take. As a composer, my primary concern is how my music sounds right now. So the fact I'm working with historical music and an historical performance practice highlights time as a phenomenon. Time within the musical performance itself, the music existing in and through time, but also the historical context of time, engaging with musical ideas and materials from 200 years ago. We've discussed how Nicholson's Roslin Castle cajoles space in the score for embellishments, injecting time into the notated score. Time and timing is one of the main preoccupations in electronic music. Even in interactive works, where the performer triggers the electronics by means of a foot pedal, the control of the unfolding of the sound is a complex question, it not being as malleable as in the hands of actual musicians. Things have to be set up in advance to unfold in a certain way. And in the most sophisticated of electronic setups, the control of unfolding is micromanaged to a very detailed level. As well as connecting to musical time, our work touches base with the broader discussions of time on a much larger scale, how music develops historically. For example, there's a rich parallel between how Nicholson's flute and style was overtaken and extinguished by the modern Böhm flute and contemporary ways of playing. Parallels to the recent phasing out of the dominant style of modernism around the mid-90s, as widely discussed by Richard Taruskin, Alex Ross, and others. Also to consider is the development of instruments and the current impact of technological obsolescence that we're experiencing with computers. This is happening to the extent that even works produced in the 1990s are no longer performable because the computer technology they used is no longer available. This is of direct importance to us in that the computer technology we are using today might itself be obsolete within only a few years. While there is a practical and cultural scientific angle to be explored here, what I find most interesting from an artistic point of view is the creative speculation that is possible in the form of new compositions surrounding re-encounters with what was left behind by history, reviving ideas and instruments that have been dormant or lost through notions of progress, in inverted commas, chance, mishap, or the many other reasons for cultural changes. As Thor Magnusson puts it in his 2021 article, The Migration of Musical Instruments on the Socio-Technological Conditions of Musical Evolution, I quote here, "With the promises of the new, we sacrificed features that become obliterated until, for example, a media archaeologist of some sort revisits the technology, the practice, and rediscovers interesting forgotten technical features. Under those terms, Martin and I take on the role of archaeologists. And while not all features have become obliterated, we have Martin's flute from 1839, for instance. Magnusson vividly portrays the merciless discarding of what once was deemed essential and beautiful. So what does happen when we re-engage with the music and performance practice and the instruments which have been left behind? How may it actually reinvigorate and bring new richness to our present artistic lives? And what does it signal for how music may change in the future? Soliloquy is a further step toward finding answers to that question, giving a creative answer, the composition, while also provoking further questions and sometimes hinting at solutions when we ask how Nicholson's performance practice may provide inspiration for interdisciplinary research. Martin will now play soliloquy, and after that we'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you both, Martin and Gavin. This is a completely new aspect we haven't done before, the performance practice of the 19th century with an instrument as a starting point for new musical activity, something which is a little bit missing in our bubble of early music, because we are digging in the past. Any comments, questions to Martin or Gavin? I see no need for a comment, which has to do perhaps with the coffee break, which is waiting. I think this is the best idea to thank you both again.
Can we see Gavin on screen?
Yes, I will try to do it.
In the background.
Exactly, and then you have
How do I do it?
to stop the presentation. And coffee break will be served as yesterday's, leaving this room on the right side in the cafeteria, and we meet here again at 11:30 sharp. But I try to.
I made, it was my last exhibition in the museum, before we got to the museum here, the Metronomes.
I did the book.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It was fantastic, especially. And obviously hope that it can keep the collection in Basel, but I failed. But I still try to get
It was a wonderful collection. One of the metronomes I insisted on putting on the cover was she knows it. Yes. I said, because if ever you see one, order it. I said, it's the only one you've ever seen. And 2 months later, you found it. It doesn't really work. It's sort of pick it up.
So it's such an interesting topic, the metronome, the musical times, and the exhibition was really did a lot of fun with that. In the center were, of course, these metronomes, but these stories to tell about how to measure time and music, and these mechanical devices, extended those to do with music. Really topic.
Some of them were beautiful too.
Yeah.
Hallo, wir machen weiter. Zur zweiten Hälfte des Vormittags. Der erste Beitrag von Robert Biggio aus London. Wie bekannt ist, er ist Flötist und vor allen Dingen auch Flötenbauer. Er hat eine Reihe von wichtigen Publikationen geschrieben. 2 stehen da vorne, kann man sich nachher ansehen. Riddle, Rose and Carve, The Art of the Flute in Britain und The Readings in the History of the Flute, beide von Tony Bingham herausgegeben in dem Verlag. Ich denke, jeder Flötist kennt sie, hat sie. Es gibt auch eine sehr gute Homepage, wie bei fast allen, die hier präsentieren, der Name robertbiggio.com. It's the same but better, the how and the why of flute inventions. Please.
Is this microphone working properly? Can you hear me? You can? Yes, you can hear me. Good. So before I begin, can I just give thanks to the organizers of this wonderful event? I'm enjoying it hugely. There was what I can only describe as an explosion of flute inventions in London from the 1830s. I want to discuss the musical reasons, the social reasons, and the economic reasons behind this explosion. I want to discuss the reasons why we do or we do not accept inventions. There's a simple or possibly simplistic answer to the matter of accepting an invention. We look for improvements when what we have is no longer suitable. We generally have to need the invention. I say generally because fashion is often a factor. Having the need is one important thing, and having the artistry to invent something better is another. But I want to discuss a number of other factors that are necessary before inventions can be accepted. Factors that all came together in London in the 19th century. I'll be describing these factors, but first it's important to show instruments that already do what players need and therefore don't need to be improved. There's one important point I want to make at the outset. With one major exception, I don't believe people who change to a new flute want to sound different. They just want to sound better, hence the title of this talk. Better, or possibly the same with less effort. The exception, of course, is the number of people who took up early instruments precisely to sound different, including, I suspect, just about everyone in this room. Of the instruments that clearly don't need improvement because they are for now good enough for most purposes, the modern Bohm flute is an excellent example. It hasn't changed in basic design since the 1850s, and players can still play almost anything they need to play on it. The Bohm flute does have a few awkward fingerings, E to F sharp to A sharp, G to B flat, and a few others, but they're mostly manageable. In fact, those problems are entirely removed by one of the inventions that I'm going to describe as Richard Cart's 1867 patent flute, which I think has a much better fingering system. Here in Basel, in fact, I need one more. Here in Basel, in fact, is another example of just such an instrument that doesn't require reinvention. This is the Basel piccolo as used during Fasnacht, when 10,000 piccolo players process through the streets. The basso piccolo serves as an illustration of something that can be improved but doesn't need to be. It does what it's supposed to do. There's little call to replace it with anything else. This piccolo is simple to make, easy to learn, inexpensive, robust, and easy to maintain. There's not a lot of subtlety required when you're part of a huge group of piccolo players parading through the streets on a cold day dressed in a clown suit. So, although there are piccolos available that are more flexible and more sophisticated than the basso piccolo, they really aren't needed. The basso piccolo is good enough. So it is with the Böhm flute. Someone might invent a better flute than the standard Böhm, and people have, but I suggest that few people would be interested because the standard Böhm already does what most people want. It's not perfect, but it does the job. Recent attempts. So is there feedback? Is this too...
We having trouble with the feedback, but we can't hear you with that. So
Okay.
That's the best I can do.
As I was saying, someone might invent a better flute than the standard Böhm, and some people have, but I suggest that few people would be interested because the standard Böhm already does what most want. Recent attempts to sell improved instruments have mostly failed, especially if they require the player to learn a new fingering system. Having to relearn a technique is a powerful reason not to take up a new instrument. By contrast, remember that improvements in the piano are mostly internal, so the player sits on the outside and doesn't have to relearn how to play. Alexander Murray's flute is an example of a radically different flute with a quite different fingering system. It not only has an open G sharp, but an open D sharp. This flute has advantages over the standard Böhm, but besides having to learn a new system, which is a good enough reason for most people not to want to try, the player would have a number of factors leading him or her away from making a change. First, there would be a greatly reduced set of instruments to choose from, and in any case, a professional player would need a spare flute, a piccolo, possibly an alto, and a bass flute. And then, should the player want to sell the flute, there would be fewer people interested in buying it. The player would need to be very unhappy indeed with the standard flute to consider changing. In fact, the number of people who chose to play this flute, apart from Alex himself, is very small. There's another recent invention that has had a rather greater impact. This is Eva Kingma's quarter-tone flute, and please bear with me, I'll get to the 19th century flutes in a minute. Eva's flute doesn't require the player to learn from scratch. You can simply ignore the extra keys, although they're in the way a bit. You can play it like a standard Böhm, but it gives you more. I asked a player who has one of these quarter-tone flutes why he got it, given that he rarely plays music that requires quarter tones or extended techniques. His answer was telling. He explained that if he wants to play, for example, a very, very quiet G sharp, he can simply finger it a quarter tone higher and relax. In essence, it made it possible for him to have the expressive range he wanted, but that he couldn't achieve on the standard Böhm flute without a lot of effort. This reason, I suggest, is similar to the one a 19th century player would have given for changing to a newly invented flute. My friend didn't want to sound different, he wanted to sound better, or at least the same with less effort. This is important. You want to sound better, not completely different. The newly invented flutes of the 19th century, in fact, don't sound much different to the older ones. Yes, there are differences. And I've lost my place. Ha! Yes, there are differences, but I suggest that these differences would be more apparent to the player than to the listener. There's in fact a greater difference in sound between the simple system flute that Böhm brought to London in 1831, that's the one up there, and the flute that Charles Nicholson was playing at the same time. If you look at them, the F-sharp hole on the Nicholson flute is bigger than the embouchure hole on the Böhm. There's a bigger difference between those two flutes than there is between a simple system flute and a conical Böhm flute made by Rudel and Rose in the 1840s. And finally, to this perhaps overlong preamble, I want to define different levels of invention. The important inventions are the ones that have a significant impact on what the flute can do, things that affect the music the player can make on an instrument rather than simple gadgets. As an example, on this 18th century flute by Richard Potter, the relatively newly invented 3 extra keys certainly have a musical effect, but not the pewter plugs, unless they don't work. The foot register does have an effect. The player can do something he or she couldn't do otherwise. The screw stopper arrangement is more of a gadget. It only makes it easier to reposition the cork, which the player could do by pushing it with a stick. The tuning slide replaces a number of left-hand joints, so that makes it at least partly significant. Other examples of 19th century gadgets are the tuning devices, such as Ward's Terminator, which has a dial on the outside of the head joint that operates a cam to reposition the stopper. Rudel and Rose's patent head joint, on which turning the crown extends the tuning slide at the same time as it moves the stopper. And Card's Melodion, which is a rack and pinion device to extend the head joint for those people who couldn't be bothered simply to pull it out. And there are other gadgets, such as Wheatstone's mouthpiece, designed for those people who don't want to go to the trouble of learning how to blow into a flute properly. Jem Hammond in the audience this is his thing, and he has it here if anyone wants to see it later. Wheatstone, I should tell you, later invented the concertina before leaving the musical instrument business altogether and inventing the telegraph. But with flutes, rather than gadgets, the important thing to note is that people have to be really unhappy, as I said, with what they can do on their existing flute before they'll be receptive to a new invention. We don't go for something different unless we really need it. This applies to just about everything in our lives, apart significantly from fashion items. We might replace a perfectly good overcoat or a pair of shoes because they're out of fashion. We might buy a new car or a new mobile phone for the same reason. But we are unlikely, for example, to replace a refrigerator because a newer model has come out. We'll only do that when the old one ceases to work. The fridge is not a fashion item. So it is with flutes. Players have only changed systems when it's become necessary to do so, when the old system no longer allowed them to do what they needed to do. Most of us are very conservative anyway. Take the violin, which looks very much like the one made by Amati in the 16th century. The violin doesn't need to look like this. It certainly doesn't need a scroll at the top of the neck. And I expect there are better ways to hold the strings in place than with a tapered wooden peg. But it would be a brave fiddle player who would turn up in an orchestra carrying an instrument with a machine head as on a guitar. And in any case, the wooden peg does the job well enough. So, these are the two most important factors that determine the success or failure of invention. One, the need. The current instrument no longer does what the player wants to do, possibly to the point that he or she is willing to put up with having to relearn. And two, conservatism. Does the player dare to take up something completely different? But by the 1840s, it's abundantly clear in London that enough players thought the simple system flute was no longer suitable. They were prepared to take up a new instrument, and inventors did not hesitate to offer them. Remember too that the people who took up a new flute such as the Boehm weren't invaders, they weren't aliens, they were the same people who had previously played the old flute. There are, I think, 4 elements necessary for the acceptance of a new invention, apart from dissatisfaction with the old flute and a desire for improvement. In addition, of course, to some artistry on the part of the inventor and the maker. The 4 elements. 1, there has to be a large and preferably rich market. Second, there can be no restraint or regulation of trade. No one can stop you making a flute if you want to. Third, there mustn't be a central authority to determine the correct type of flute you should play. And fourth, there have to be plenty of skills available to actually make the flutes. It happens that these elements all came together in London in the couple of decades around the middle of the 19th century. I'll examine these. First of all, the market. It isn't enough simply to say that the flute market in London was huge. I want to show you how huge and also how rich many flute players were. But please be aware that the tiniest percentage of these were professional players. By far the greatest number were amateurs, and it seems quite rich ones. The size of the market is clear from the fact that flute makers, flute teachers, and publishers of flute music advertised in the daily press. This is a random selection of things from the Times. It's rare to see similar advertisements for other instruments. And there's a famous piece in the Athenaeum in 1829 that claimed that 1 man in 10 played the flute. Probably an exaggeration, but it's a telling one. An interesting fact is that Rudel and Rose advertised in the Athenaeum, which was an intellectual literary journal for well-educated people. In the 1820s, that meant rich people, which perhaps tells us what Rudel and Rose considered their target market. And here's some evidence about how rich flute players could be. This is a price list from Monzani, London maker in the 1820s. You can see he was charging 2.5 times as much for a flute with 8 silver keys as for an oboe with 8 silver keys. Two instruments that would have needed much the same effort and materials to make. The reason can only be that flute players were prepared to pay more. How much they paid is worth considering. This is a price list from Rudel and Rose from the 1820s. It shows a standard 8-keyed flute at 12 guineas. A guinea is a pound plus a shilling. So 12 guineas is 12 pounds, 12 shillings, of course. To put that in context, a skilled man on an average wage, such as a bricklayer, might have earned £70 a year for a long day and a 6-day week. So a Rudel and Rose flute would represent 2 months of that man's salary. A bricklayer in Britain today will earn the national average wage of £28,000. So 2 months of his wages, but only 5 days a week, would be about £5,000. It's rather more if we calculate his wages by the hour rather than by the month. Now, while it's true that this amount is a lot less than the price of the bricklayer's van, remember that today the bricklayer has access to credit cards and bank loans, neither of which would have existed in 1830. In 1830, it would simply have been impossible for anyone other than the rich to afford 12 guineas for a flute. And as to the number of flute players, I made a rough estimate of the number of flutes produced by the half-dozen leading London makers, those who competed on quality rather than on price. Those are Rudel and Rose, Prowse or Clementi, Monzani, Willis and his successors, Millhouse and Potter. And it would seem from serial numbers and from their advertising that both Rudel and Rose and Prowse were producing about 300 flutes a year each, at a rate of about 1 every working day. At a conservative estimate then, these 6 makers were together producing up to 2,000 flutes a year, and this doesn't include the makers of cheaper flutes. In fact, I estimate William Henry Potter's factory alone might have produced instruments at the rate of up to 5 a day, based on the advertisement for the contents of his business when Potter retired. This shows 200 flutes in stock, as well as 5 lathes. This was a substantial factory, and you won't be surprised to learn that Potter died rather rich. And of course, flutes accumulate, so after 10 years, these makers would have produced up to 20,000 flutes. That's a lot of flute players, and a lot of money. And let me repeat, the overwhelming majority of flute players were amateurs, well over 99%. And given that the number of professional flute performers was probably in single figures. From a business point of view, amateurs were the market, and some amateurs had enough money to buy flutes like this. I can't begin to imagine how expensive this was. And as to the term amateur, please remember that amateur didn't mean bad. It simply referred to someone who didn't earn a living playing the flute, or perhaps didn't need to earn a living at all. An independently wealthy amateur might have had plenty of time to develop great skill. And even if the amateur was not skilled, it was important for the maker to sell this person a good flute. The amateur might not have been discerning, but he or she had a teacher, and the teacher certainly was discerning. So there are plenty of flute players prepared to pay a lot of money for their instruments. That accounts for the first element, the size of the market. Excuse me. The second element was restraint and regulation of trade. This relates to the ability of anyone to start making and selling flutes. In 19th century Britain, there was a completely free market with nothing to stop a maker. You didn't need the permission of government to set up in business. The livery companies, the guilds, as it were, had lost most of their powers to regulate trade. Trade unions had yet to acquire much power of their own. Britain had virtually no restraints on the market. If you wanted to do something, you just did it, and your success depended on nothing more than your ability to sell the product. The third point is no central authority to tell you what sort of flute you should play. There was no one in Britain who would do that, unlike, for example, in France, where the professor of flute at the Paris Conservatoire, which was the national conservatoire, could and did precisely that. Toulouse opposed the böhm flute and promoted his own instrument, which just happened to be made in a factory that he owned. But his successor, Dorus, played a silver böhm flute, and so it seems that almost every other serious player from that point. There was no such central authority in Britain, not even the Royal Academy of Music, which opened in 1823. In its first 50 years, the Academy had just 14 flute students, of whom only 7 had any notable success in the profession. And from what is known about these players, there's no single type of flute they played. Frederick Hill and Joseph Richardson promoted and played Sycamore flutes. Edward Card presumably played one of his father's flutes. Benjamin Wells is known to have played flutes of a number of different systems, as did John Radcliffe, who played a number of different flutes before designing his own. In the case of Radcliffe, he is known to have played Cart's 1851 patent flute at the 1862 London exhibition, and then he played a conical version of Cart's 1867 flute, which I happen to own, before inventing the first Radcliffe flute, which it happens I also own, and I think it's in this room if anyone wants to see it. And to confuse matters further, in the picture of Radcliffe in the first edition of his tutor for the Radcliffe flute, he's shown holding a Pratton's perfected flute. Clearly, there was a free market in the choice of flutes. Fourth, there have to be plenty of skills available. An inventor in 1830s London would have had a huge range of skilled people to make instruments or parts of instruments. In 1830, from a point where Farringdon Station now stands, you would have been within a few hundred meters of countless skilled people, jewelers, silversmiths, clock and watchmakers, scientific instrument makers, plus a vast pyramid of supporting craftspeople, engravers, stone setters, metal polishers, casting specialists, tool makers, engine turners, case makers, suppliers of parts and of tools. As this was also the center of the printing industry, there would have been engineers to make and maintain the presses, and when they started using steam, there would have been people who built and maintained steam engines too. Not far to the east, Shoreditch was the center of the woodworking industry, cabinet makers, turners, box makers, plus their pyramid of suppliers. And there had to be lots of people working in each trade or the system wouldn't work. A watchmaker, for example, watchmakers would need their work engraved before it could be sold, and if their usual engraver was not available, there had to be others. The system wouldn't work otherwise. So it was that someone setting up as a flute maker would have had access to skilled people to make every part of the flute. It was for this reason that inventors could set up in business without too much trouble, even if they themselves had no ability to make anything. Sycamore, Pratton, and Clinton are examples of such people, players who had an idea for a new flute and found someone or some people to make it. And some of these flutes were made with quite innovative techniques. Excuse me. Sycamore's flutes, for example, were unlike any others and were made in what I describe as a modular manner. They used the same casting pattern for the B flat, the G sharp, and the D sharp keys. The two ring finger extension keys were identical, and the key cups were clearly produced in bulk and screwed into the key shanks. No other flutes were made this way, and I have to say the craftsmanship was superb. There was nothing quite like the Sycamore, and I consider it the best of the advanced simple system flutes. It's important to understand that successful flute makers didn't have to make every part of the flute. It stands to reason that they would subcontract some work. We know that there were specialist key makers, which may explain why so many flutes by different London makers have similar keys. There's more. It's difficult to imagine that flute makers made their own lining tubes. Why would they when there were brass instrument makers and telescope makers who could do the job so efficiently? Likewise, silver ferrules. Someone probably turned those out in quantity. And tools. Why would a flute maker make his own tools when there were specialists around who could do it and do it better? Pardon me. One of the main London tool and machine tool dealers, Holtzapfel, even listed flute dreamers in his catalogue. As an aside, John Jacob Holtzapfel, formerly Jean-Jacques, came from Strasbourg. His brother Jean-Daniel Holtzapfel moved to Paris where he made flutes. Flute makers would have subcontracted tasks such as engraving and engine turning, and any specialized components such as the four-start screw inside Rudel and Rose's patent head joint would have been made by a specialist, given that even in the 1850s, their successor firm, Rudel Cart, didn't own a single screw-cutting lathe. So let me repeat the four elements that I think are necessary for this explosion of inventions. First, a huge and rich market. Second, no one to stop you. Third, no one to determine what sort of flute you should play. And fourth, plenty of skilled people to make them. Add to this any frustration with the existing flute, and this happened. Now, what's particularly interesting about all these is all were invented in London except the very most important ones, those by Boehm. Let me go from the left. On the left, this is Gerok and Wolf's supposed Böhm flute of 1831. I think what happened with this flute was Böhm described that he, having heard Nicholson play, he wanted to improve his flute. He went to his friend Christopher Gerok's workshop. Gerok was also German, another London maker, of course, and he did some experiments. Gerok then, I think after Böhm left, made this based on what must have been Böhm's experiments, and it's a monstrosity. It doesn't do the things that Böhm expected to do, and it's mechanically absolutely horrible. If you want to read about it, it's in my book. The second one is Böhm's conical flute, the 1832 flute, which I think has been described a few times already the last couple of days. The third one is by William Card. This uses Böhm's fingering more or less in the right hand and simple system fingering in the left, but he has, as you can see, an enormous stretch. I don't think I could play this flute. The next one is a very interesting one by Cornelius Ward. This one is unlike any other. It has an open G sharp and an open D sharp, and if you need to use your little finger to close the D sharp key, you can't use your little finger to operate the foot joint key, so he gave that job to the thumb, and there are wires running down the side. The next one is, sorry, I'm losing my voice. The next one is the Sycamore, which, on which he put an extension for the two ring fingers to put those holes in the same place. But before I go any further and describe these in any more detail, there's one constant feature in them all. The holes are all evenly spaced and of roughly even size, unlike on the simple system flute, where the holes had to be where the player could reach them, and therefore had to be of different sizes to adjust the tuning. And on all these new flutes, there's a mechanism to accommodate this reach. On most of these flutes, the inventor tried to keep the simple system fingering as much as possible. I call these advanced simple system flutes. Four inventions required a new fingering system: Böhm, Ward, Card. Thank you. Can I talk while? It might sound horrible. Actually, I'll keep it for a minute. Three inventions: the Böhm, Ward, and Card offered a fully vented mechanism. Four of these, Böhm, Ward, Card, and Card with only one change, and Card had a completely different fingering system. Fully vented means all the holes below the note being played stands open. And as for Card, his view seems to have been that if you had to learn a new fingering system, he thought his was better than Böhm's, and he was right. These inventions lose something too. What was largely missing in his flutes was the ability to glide from one note to the next, as Martin Shaw has just been demonstrating, and to use finger vibrato. John Clinton, in the second edition of his tutor for the conical Böhm flute, uniquely included a page of instructions for these techniques, but the lack of any other mention suggests they weren't missed, and there's in fact always the possibility that some musicians considered them rather vulgar. Let me carry on describing these flutes. Does this work if I point to this? Yes, it does. This is the Sycamore. These are two of the 5 models of flute that John Clinton designed. Clinton published the first tutor for the conical Böhm flute. He was very keen on it. He then wanted Böhm to appoint him his agent to make his new flute. Böhm refused. Clinton then denounced Böhm and said that everything Böhm was doing was wrong, and he went back to making flutes with simple system fingerings that were conical. He also said metal was a bad idea. The cylindrical Böhm flute was patented in 1847. Patents lasted for 14 years. 14 years later, in 1861, Clinton started selling cylindrical metal flutes with Böhm fingering. Let me go on with the others. The next one is, can I remember? The next two, in fact, are Richard Cart's version of flutes with simple system fingering, but evenly spaced. And the ones at the end, the three silver ones at the end, are various iterations of Böhm's 1851 patent, which uses, Cart's 1851 patent, which uses Böhm's bore, Böhm's acoustic, but has a different fingering system. Now, this takes us up to about 1851, and there's more. Okay. The one on the left is Böhm's final version of the 1851 system. This one has many advantages over the Böhm, many fingering advantages over the Böhm, not so many strange, awkward cross fingerings. It also has an open D. All fingers off gives you D, not C sharp. The next one is another 1851 system flute. This one is, I think, the oldest surviving gold flute. The one after that is Pratten's Perfected. Now, Robert Sidney Pratten was one of the leading players in London. He had promoted and played Sycamore flutes. He then stole Sycamore's flute maker and designed his own instrument, and that's it. Again, conical, simple system fingerings, and fully keyed. Where are we? The next one is, I think I won't bother boring you with all of these because it might just be a bit too much, but as we go along, we have various versions of Cart's attempts to make a Böhm system flute, but with a simple system fingering. And the gold one, fourth from the end, is the most important of them all. This is the 1867 flute, which I think is the best system yet devised. All the problems, the fingering problems of the standard Böhm flute are resolved by this. And some people are beginning to be more interested in playing this. So about 1850, the simple system flute had fallen out of favor completely among professional players in Britain. This is where the Rudel-Cart stock records are so instructive. This firm dominated the market, and from the records we can count the number of each type of flute they made. It's evident that simple system flutes became a small part of their output, and so unimportant did they consider this market that they rarely wasted their own workshop time making them. Most were bought in from other makers, such as Wild, and incidentally sold at a huge markup. From the records, too, we can see exactly which type of flute the leading players bought, and all the leading players are listed. And from this, we can see that virtually every professional player used a modern flute of one type or another. The Böhm, including a Rockstro model, 1867, or a Radcliffe. In addition, Rudel-Cart indulged amateur inventors and made flutes to the designs of inventors such as Martin Franklin, Welsh, Matthews, and William Chester Minor. And this extraordinary flute at the end is a gold flute with more keys on it than I've seen on anything else, made for James Matthews. It's, I think, the only flute that I've failed to play a scale on. Matthews was a wealthy Midlands industrialist. I think he was a brickmaker. There's a handwritten notebook in his handwriting that has all the fingerings for this, and one note has 17 different fingerings. Now, commercial success is an important consideration. The market decided what would and would not succeed. As a crude measure, the number of surviving examples tells us what was successful and what was not. There are, for example, very few flutes by Ward or by Card, so it's safe to assume they didn't make very many. It's therefore reasonable to assume that they weren't especially commercially successful. Even if those inventors did not make many flutes themselves, if the invention was such a good idea, someone else would have copied it, at least when the patent ran out, if indeed there was a patent. By contrast, the inventions of Böhm, Cart, and Sycamore were the most successful commercially, and there are countless surviving examples. It's important, too, for an inventor to produce enough instruments to make an impact on the market. If there are many examples of an invention, many players will see it, and many might be inspired to buy one. Conversely, of course, if there are few examples, fewer people will see it, fewer will want to buy one. Producing enough instruments to make such an impact requires a specific set of skills, those of the manager. A large workshop like that of Rudel and Rose or Prowse or Potter would have needed someone to deal with the prosaic matters such as buying and maintaining equipment, maintaining stocks of materials, hiring and training staff, dealing with subcontractors, keeping the accounts, and most important, actually selling the flute. Remember that in the time a maker is dealing with a customer, he's not making flutes. So a maker working alone is therefore at a huge disadvantage. So a division of labor is vital. There are virtually no individual flute makers in this time marketing their own work. The majority of flutes I've just shown were made by Rudel and Rose or by their successor company, Rudel Cart. There were other leading makers in Britain, and They were the leading makers in Britain, and they became so, first of all, by being good at what they did, but also, most importantly, by being good businessmen as well. What they were brilliant at was the one thing all successful businesses can do. They discovered what their customers wanted, and they sold it to them. This led to them being innovative in a way their competitors were not, with the result that they thrived where most of the others withered away. And they thrived not just because of innovation, but because they were very good at the prosaic matter of running a business. And interestingly, after Richard Cart died, they stopped being innovative, and they withered away too. The same but better. Better not because they sounded different, but simply because they made sounding good that much easier. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now the question is, wer hat's erfunden? No, joke, nobody understands here, no Swiss people here. Theobald Böhm would be the answer. Thank you, Robert, for your interesting talk, which gives another inside look what are the important elements of this instrument in transition, because it has a lot to do with market, as all things in our human world, and can explain a lot of developments which you are illustrated with wonderful color photos. Any comments, questions for Robert? Many. Two. So many. One.
Hi, thanks very much, Robert. Really fascinating insights there, as ever. I'm a big fan of Robert's work. Really fascinated to hear about all the different elements that brought about all these many different systems. I wonder what you feel the role of the teacher was within these changes. The role of the teacher.
The role of the teacher? Well, probably major, because the teacher would tell the student what the student should play. Or else the student would go to the teacher who played the sort of flute the student wanted to play. There's a related story in the middle of the 20th century. In Britain, just about everybody then played a wooden flute. Geoffrey Gilbert, a leading player, started playing a metal flute. He was a very good player, a brilliant teacher, and very influential. And because of him, just about everyone in Britain now plays a metal flute. So the teacher, an influential and very good teacher like Geoffrey Gilbert, is very important. Good question. Thank you.
Hi, Robert. First, a big compliment about all these pictures and the documentation of these instruments, because I don't know, do you do the pictures yourself?
Yes.
So that's great, because they all you can compare them very, very well. They are the pictures are taken absolutely fantastically. So I like your book very much. So this is one comment I have to say. The other is, all this diversity of flute models, of course, reflects a time where everybody was searching for his own ways to find a new tool. And I compare that also with the searches of modern flutists who tried all these different kind of head joints, which was a big fashion in the beginning of this century. So everybody needed a new head joint. And then this new head joint was the best ever. And some years later, oh, I can't play that. It doesn't have the depth which I want to have. So in order not to actually practice or get to the result and to work on it, a new head joint had to be ordered. So it's good for the flute makers, but it's not always the best for the development of the instruments.
As a flute maker, I have to say it's a good idea. But on the other hand, the leading player of the middle of the 20th century in London was Gareth Morris, who played a wooden flute. He once said to me, he thought it was silly people kept trying different instruments. He said, your flute should be like your friend. It may have some things about it that you don't like, but you get round them. The same as with the friends. Your friend may have something irritating, but you, for the most part, you like it. He would just say you had to get used to your flute, and he played one flute for the whole of his life. This doesn't happen very often anymore, which is good for flute makers like us.
Yes, you know that the divorce rate in European countries are 50 to 50% at the moment. Modern society has changed a lot.
I can maybe add to the question of which role teachers played. You could actually do the same presentation with flute methods, English flute methods. So, and you could also question, is it really a better one or another one?
It's a bit difficult to understand. Are you asking about?
I'm not asking. I'm just putting a comment. No, I'm just putting a comment. You could have given the same presentation on flute methods, English flute methods. Because it's just a matter of selling, and in these methods or in many methods, they always they add some publicity about flute. So teachers' methods and then flutes, they are really connected and then related to each other as well.
If there are no other questions, then thank you again, Robert.
Thank you for this.
Welcome. We leave the two books here for the moment. You can have a look afterwards if you haven't seen it before. And now, for the break, we have a short presentation of Anne Postlauk, who is launching a new recording and project now for the next years, and she will just give a short insight.
I would like to take the opportunity today to present a very nice, very exciting project that I have decided to start. It started actually last year when I recorded together with Toby the 13th solo of Grand Solo by Tulou on a fantastic flute by Tulou, which is in the possession of Claire Genewijn. I could do this recording with the help of a funding of the Flemish government. And after doing that, I was so happy with this flute that I thought, okay, why only recording one Tulou Grand Solo? Why not just recording all the concours pieces of the Paris Conservatory? And I asked for fundings again of the Flemish government, and I got them at least for the first half of it. So what I'm going to do is that I take this list of the piece of the concours works. I guess you all know them, I hope so. You see that there are quite many pieces written on this list. Maybe I shortly explain. Students at the time who were about 14, 15, 17 years old, in their final year or in one of these years, they had to play a piece in front of a jury. And most of the time, this piece was composed either by the flute teacher or by somebody else. So the flute class had to play this piece. And we have a list which is not complete. It's incomplete and it's not always correct. But we have at least part of this list. And what I want to do is to record all the pieces for the keyed flute, for the complicated system flute. And you see, the list starts with Berbiquier. This is the first piece that we are going to publish today, or we have published on YouTube last night at 11 o'clock, which is not actually the concertino, the fifth concertino by Berbiquier, because it hasn't existed at this time. So I guess they haven't played it if it didn't exist, or they were very clever. So we decided to take the fifth concerto instead, which was published 10 years ago, and it's a beautiful piece. We recorded the second and the third movement of this piece on a flute by Thibaut Villefrère, which is from about the same time. Yes, I have to add maybe that I'm not recording all the pieces on the same flute, but I will use a different flute for every piece, a different original French flute for every piece. And you see the list has pieces by Tulou, and up to 1860, where I will stop the first half of this project, because in 1860 the teacher changes from Tulou to Dorus, and he started using Böhm flutes. Yes, a very interesting point for me as a musician and as a flutist, of course. I took, again, lessons with a teacher. My teacher was Tulou. Fortunately, he wrote a method, and he also wrote these great pieces. And what's so fantastic about these pieces is that he tells you everything you have to do. You actually don't have to add a lot. You just have to understand the basic features of how to play 19th century music, and he gives you a lot of hints how to perform the music. He gives you the cadences, he gives you the articulation, dynamics, of course, and all that kind of stuff. And also in his method, he tells you, for example, which fingerings you should use. And this was something which was really interesting, because when I started my doctorate, I was following Fürstenau. I had a different teacher, Mr. Fürstenau, who gave me 124 fingerings. And I learned them. And these fingerings are not at all the same as the fingerings of Tulou. So I had to change my whole fingering system. They fit perfectly with the flute, and they also fit perfectly with the way of how Tulou played, because I think he must have played very different from Fürstenau. So Tulou, I think he was very, very virtuoso, and also in his critics, you read that he was the real singer. So singers should listen to him to see how they should sing, and you find this back also in his method. But it's was very complicated, but I hope I managed to do it. So yes, also very interesting for me, a really big challenge. What I will also add to this project, I will not just play the pieces. I would like to know who were the students, who were the people, the young boys who played this music. And what I will try to do is to find information about these boys. In the first Baby Gear that we just published, I found two on the list in an inconstant. There are two names, Loret and Carrière. I didn't find anything about the Carrière boy, but Loret, he was a flutist apparently. He was 15 when he did his final exam, and I have a lot of respect for these boys who have played this music because it's not easy at all. Why is it not easy? I found the most difficult part of these solos were all these trills and the little embellishments. This was really a great challenge for me. So a lot of respect to these boys. A very interesting point that maybe not many of you know is that there are notes by the teachers, by Thulu, not for all years, but for some of these years. And here it's Thulu who wrote comments about the playing of his students. So I will add in the text, in my explanation text also, the comments about the students. I will publish them. It's not yet published on my website, but you will find it on my website. On YouTube, I already added some information, and Facebook, and then all these social things, you know. I tried to use flutes of as many flute makers as I can. So I don't want just to focus on the greatest flute makers of France, which are Godefroy and then Nonon and Bélisson, but I also try to find flutes by makers which are maybe not very, very known. For example, Tabar. Who has ever heard of Tabar? Except some people. Yes. Or Truchot et company. So see, it's not very known, and I don't know if there are recordings on these flutes. So I really try to find a good balance because of these flute makers. I really have to thank all the flute collectors that will provide the flute for me, and especially also the Klingende Museum in Bern. Uli's collection has very beautiful instruments, so I will use quite a lot of instruments by Uli. Without them, I couldn't do this project, so I'm really very, very grateful to them. And at the end, I won't show you the music, so you can listen to it on YouTube anyway. The first recording session, that's one point which was very, very hard actually to do and to organize, because all these flutes, they don't have just one pitch. They have 20 pitches. So to realize this project was also quite a challenge, because I cannot just start with the first piece and I take the first flute and then I record the second piece and use the second flute. So we don't do it in chronological order. We will use 3 different pianos. One is in 430, the other one is in 435, and the third one is in 440. It's all pianos by Pleyel. Now we recorded, 2 weeks ago, we recorded the first 6 pieces with beautiful flutes on 432. So it's not 430, but 432, with a beautiful Pleyel piano from 1829, which is in a collection in Enschede in the Netherlands. So you will hear the first 6 solos, grand solo, on 432 flutes. I will publish every second week. I will publish a next piece, so you will have 2 weeks' time to get used to the flute. The question is, of course, and I would be really very curious after the project to know whether you hear a difference. Of course, you can say it's my sound on these flutes, and also we should record it on with exactly the same microphones in the same situation and all that kind of stuff. But we can't. We would need much more money to do this. But I would be very curious if you hear a difference, because I feel a very, very huge difference between all these flutes, even if I have just 3 Godefroy flutes. I just recorded on 3 different Godefroy flutes, one with a serial number 1079, the other with 1700, and another one with 3000. And they all are very, very, very different, even if they are from the same maker, which is very interesting. But of course, we as a player, we feel these differences much more than the listener. So whenever you want to write a comment on YouTube, I would be very happy. That's it. Thank you very much and have a nice break.
Thank you, Anne, and good luck for the next months, years. Now we have the break. I've heard there are some really flute-interested people. They will jump the lunch and go to room 1005, where they can see instruments, play, and discuss. Other normal people can look for something to eat, like yesterday going down to the Barfüßerplatz, or if you're leaving the Schola left side, there are a lot of restaurants. We're meeting here again at 2 o'clock.